Шановні пані та панове, президент України.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky.
Шановні учасники, це важливе.
Dear participants, this is an important information notice. Please do not publish any materials before 3 p.m. You must not do that. Dear participants, the floor goes to Andriy Kostin, Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Dear Mr. President, dear participants, friends and partners, it's a pleasure to welcome you here at the United for Justice Conference, United for Justice. Today, the event is dedicated to ensuring accountability of Russia for mass systemic violations against civilian infrastructure of Ukraine. We are stepping up all the efforts to provide for accountability and to have a just peace. It is my honor to give the floor to Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, to open today's conference. Thank you, dear Mr. Prosecutor General. Dear President, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, dear guests of the conference United for Justice. The word justice in different languages of the world sounds different. However, it must be perceived everywhere without any misunderstandings. It must be perceived in the same way every people understand the price they pay for justice in every country that really respects the life of a person, really respects international law. It is impossible not to have justice, and I highlight again and again, in all countries, irrespective of how their national legislation is set out, what treaties it ratified, and whether the treaty was indeed in force, and the Rome Statute is in force in that or another country. Justice unites people, it is true, because aspirations for justice is the foundation of our human culture. And now, the very aspiration for justice unites us all, unites us and everyone who is working together with us in order to protect the human life and our country against Russian attacks. As of today, we have at least 1,300 reasons for this work to be continued. 137,000 war crimes is the number of war crimes committed by Russia today. It's what we know of. Crimes against peace and humanity, against our country, against our people, against Ukraine and Ukrainians. 137,000. It means that we need to have at least the same number of court judgments. Bucha, Olenivka, Yahidna. Dozens of these horrendous and nerve-wracking pictures in Ukrainian cities, in Ukrainian villages, hundreds of thousands of other types of war crimes committed by Russia. I guess there isn't a country that wouldn't have heard about what the invader has done to our country and to our people, and we need to make sure that there is accountability for that, because justice has no borders and boundaries. It must be valued everywhere, in America, in Australia, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere. Human dignity and human life need to be protected. There can be no exceptions to that in any country, and this has to do with countries that still might be visited by terrorist number one, by war criminal, and by the author and the instigator of the very cruel genocidal war waged against Ukraine. The world has tons of pages of declarations, many treaties. There is a Rome Statute for more than 100 countries in the world. The Rome Statute needs to be operational. However, recently we saw exception in Mongolia for Putin. It's not somebody's responsibility of some individual, it's the responsibility of the whole world not to have the norms that remain, not to have them ruined, not to have the disintegration of the law, and to make sure that the arrest warrant that was issued regarding the main Russian war criminal, that would ensure the isolation. I thank colleagues, I thank Karim Khan, the prosecutor general of the ICC. I thank you all who worked on that, because this is how the society reacts towards criminals. They isolate them, and that is how we must react regarding Putin. We must pressure him, we must isolate him, we must make him end this war and seek peace. There are countries that have valid Rome Statute. There are countries where the Rome Statute is not ratified, and this is global players. And in a couple of months, we'll have a summit of the G20 in Brazil. We heard the message from the government that they intended to invite Putin, but what happened? They'll have to find loops in the law, and they'll have to ruin the law and ignore the Rome Statute. Mustn't there be responsibility and accountability for that? Dear ladies and gentlemen, the justice does not arise on its own. It does not arise out of nowhere. The laws are operational when people act to protect the law, when people act to enforce the law. And in this is the very essence of our cooperation. That is why we are united for justice. Each and every one who brings the accountability of the Russian state and of the Russian political and military leadership, of the Russian war criminals, we must all come do the common denominator. We must have the common result. We all the partners in the world, we must perceive that the justice has won, and everyone who suffered because of the aggression knows this evil was not with impunity. I want to thank you all for today's conference. I thank you all who care for justice in the world. Slava Ukraini! We thank the President of Ukraine for participation in today's event.
Take this opportunity to say a few words about our conference and topics that will be covered today. Since the war began in 2014, the Russian military has flagrantly disregarded the fundamentals of international law and the laws and customs of warfare. Indiscriminate shelling, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, these have characterized Russian military actions in the occupied territory of Donbass. In 2022, with the full-scale invasion, this barbaric method spreads across the entire country, becoming a deliberate tactic of the occupiers. The destructions of homes, hospitals, schools, energy facilities, ports and grain storage sites was intended to break the Ukrainian spirit of resistance. Instead, it has united Ukrainians and our partners in the determination to stop the aggressor, restore justice, and hold the perpetrators accountable. During this conference, we will explore the potential avenues of achieving these goals. So, let's begin. З початку війни у 2014 році
As of the same is now being repeated in English, that Russia has flagrantly violated international law. They conducted attacks against civilian objects in 2022. These barbarian methods have become widespread throughout Ukraine, and they are the deliberate tactics of the invaders. The ruination of energy, security objects, and grain storage, hospitals, etc., was supposed to break Ukrainians, but it united Ukrainians, and it gave an impetus to make sure that the perpetrator is held liable, and today we will speak of the actionable methods of working on that to make sure that we achieve. Another notice to you: it is prohibited to publish any materials before 3 p.m. today.
Publishing any materials related to this conference is prohibited until 3 p.m. Thank you. Шановні пані та панове, маю честь
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome Attorney General Mr. Andrei Kostin.
Dear colleagues, prosecutors, ministers, friends and partners, attorney generals, special representatives of the United Nations mechanisms, Secretary General of United Nations Special Representative Pramila Patten, dear Karim, dear Ladislav, President of Eurojust, colleagues, friends and partners. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today at the 7th United for Justice Conference dedicated to the accountability for the attacks against civilian objects. I still vividly remember the launch of the first United for Justice Conference on the 5th of March in Lviv last year. That conference united us around a simple truth. It is not merely our, Ukraine's, war against aggressor, but a global war that puts international peace and security, all international architecture, at risk. We also raised a legitimate question then. How should Ukraine and international community respond in a meaningful and resourceful way so that we, secure respect for rule-based international order, and impunity so well embraced by Russia, and bring justice to victims and survivors of aggression and of the atrocity crimes. The answer was simple and clear, but at the same time complex and challenging. It necessitated multifaceted response on national as well as international level through an intrinsic web of accountability. And we have been weaving this web since the very first day of Russia's full-scale aggression, together with our friends and partners that are present here today. For all of us, there can be no task more important than renewing our commitment to international law and principles, the rules of peace, the rules that allow democracies and all honest nations to deliver security to their people. And for this generation, almost 80 years after Nuremberg, this can only come when Moscow is put on trial for its crimes and finally brought inside this system of accountability. Therefore, let me use this opportunity to express our deep appreciation for the unwavering commitment and support to Prosecutor Khan, Commissioner Reinders, Ministers Van Veel and Khabijan, Attorney Generals Hermer, Grunskene, Stukans and Parmas, Deputy Prosecutor General Korneliuk, President of Eurojust Hamran, Special Representative of Secretary General Pramila Patan, and Head of War Crime Accountability Team of the Department of Justice of the United States, Christian Levesque. We're equally grateful for the dedication, resoluteness and assistance provided by the individual states, international organizations, and civil society. Special thank you goes to all my colleagues in Ukraine, investigators and prosecutors, all those whose determination and resilience allowed us to secure the national web of accountability, to all soldiers fighting in the battlefield for our freedom and victory. United, we have made and can make a remarkable progress. Ukraine's multidimensional quest for justice and accountability has been presented within Ukraine's peace formula. In line with that, our national efforts are focused on investigation and prosecution of more than 137,000 incidents of war crimes, alongside with the crime of aggression and crime of genocide. We have already identified 676 war crime suspects, including 51 persons for attacks and indiscriminate shelling of civilian infrastructure. Among those, 7 are high-ranking Russian military involved in strikes against Ukraine's electricity infrastructure. In this regard, Ukraine's recent decision to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is a testament of our commitment to the values that are building block of the international criminal justice. Advance and uphold justice for the international crimes. Secure reparation for victims and survivors of such crimes. The International Criminal Court issued 6 arrest warrants against Russia's high-level officials, including Putin, former Minister of Defense and Chief of Joint Staff Forces. It is emblematic that 4 out of 6 arrest warrants concerns Russia's prohibited attacks against Ukraine's electricity infrastructure, a topic that we will address during today's conference. The setting up of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, joined by the ICC and the United States, has become a building block for Ukraine's joint investigation team. Apart from ICC, more than 20 states share our burden by investigating international crimes committed in Ukraine. We already have successful cases in the United States and Lithuania. This year, the Register of Damage, a unique international instrument to document evidence and claims related to damage, loss, and injury caused to victims and survivors, has become fully operational. The sanctions regime and innovative mechanisms has been playing a crucial complementary role. Russia's brutality and atrocious actions have the devastating human consequences. More than 13,000 civilians lost their lives. Ukraine faces escalating attacks on civilian objects and its critical infrastructure with winter approaching. Russia's deliberate strikes on energy grids, water supply systems, and essential services aim to weaponize winter, plunging millions of our citizens into hardship. These strikes are not just acts of war. They are systematic efforts to dismantle civilian life by disrupting electricity, heating, medical care, food supply, education, and other vital services. By targeting more than 184,000 civilian objects, including hospitals, maternity houses, schools, other educational facilities, and agricultural facilities, Russia seeks to undermine not only Ukraine's resilience, but also the very foundation of civilian life. Therefore, a great deal of accountability work remains to be done. First and foremost, we should hold Moscow leadership responsible for the crime of aggression. This war did not just happen. It was planned and prepared for a long period of time, and with no small skill and cunning. Establishment of special tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression is not a product of abstract speculations. It is Ukraine's rightful inquest to utilize international law against the makers of the greatest menace. Second, we need to continue our efforts on national and international level to secure accountability of all planners, organizers, and implementers of atrocity crimes. Concurrently, we must undertake immediate actions to secure adequate living conditions and safety to the civilian population, return each and every Ukrainian child unlawfully deported to Russia, protect natural environment, and defend peaceful cities from barrage of bombs and missiles. Our path is and will be demanding, cumbersome, and lengthy. United, we can ensure comprehensive accountability for the core international crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine, sending a strong signal to all. No one is or would be above the law. In the end, justice will always prevail. Slava Ukraini!
Дякуємо, пане генеральний прокурор.
Thank you, Prosecutor General.
The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim A.A. Han Casey. Mr. Han.
My dear friend, colleague, Prosecutor General Andrei Kostin, Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Attorney Generals, Ministers of Justice, Special Representatives of the Secretary General, dear Ladislav, President of Eurojust, prosecutors, ladies and gentlemen, friends. This is an important conference. That's why you're here. And it's an extraordinary conference. When we started and we saw the video that was played before the address of the President of the Republic of Ukraine, we saw pictures of Kharkiv and Kherson, of Bucha, and we've been to those locations. Brenda Hollis, who leads the Ukraine team, has been. Members of the prosecution of Ukraine live in those locations. They investigate places that are their homes. When we leave, they stay. And as the adage goes, a picture tells 1,000 words. It's appropriate, it's trite, to pause for a moment and realize it's not a Hollywood production. Slick and professional though it was. That lady that was shivering and cowering in the street as a bomb exploded almost in her face. The people in a barber shop, obviously I don't go to barber shops, but that's not a joke, it's a reality. People in their everyday life are affected by conflict. And it's great credit to President Zelensky. It's a great credit to the government of Ukraine, to you, Prosecutor General, to the people of Ukraine, that before there's a cessation of hostilities, before there's peace, Ukraine made a strategic decision that justice, the rights of the vulnerable, would not be an afterthought. It would be full center stage. And since the first conference in Lviv in March of last year, real concrete action has been taken. So So the point I really want to emphasize is that this is not a talk shop. Since that first conference, the teams involved, Ukraine, Office of the Prosecutor, joint investigative teams, innovative models like rotational forensic models, and the work of independent judges scrutinize what has been presented have led not only to convictions and warrants in Ukraine, but to warrants issued by the judges of the International Criminal Court. Since that event in March, as the Prosecutor General mentioned, 6 warrants have been issued, not only against President Vladimir Putin and Madam Lvova-Belova, but the 4 senior members of the Russian Armed Forces, including the Minister of Defense and Chief of the General Staff. Since that event, an office was opened in Kyiv, and Kyiv has been designated a duty station. And again, it's not for a photo opportunity. The presence of the team in Ukraine has led to forging stronger bonds, open cooperation with Ukraine, civil society, and the many actors that realize that justice is a right for all. If we're not to have a world driven by as the Wild West, where people can grab what they want, take what they want, do what they want, the power of the bomb and the bullet prevails over human spirit and the rights of the vulnerable, the law must be seen to play a part and move at the speed of relevance. Apart from that joint investigative team, the presence in Ukraine, the openness has led that on the 8th of July, when the Ahmadist hospital was bombed by a KH, an X-101 cruise missile, members of my office could go to that location within 24 hours. And yesterday I went with the Prosecutor General, with Brenda Hollis, with other colleagues from Ukraine and my team, again to that location. And the point to really underscore is that this is not, when we talk about civilian objects, churches or mosques or synagogues around the world or temples, hospitals or schools or theaters, there are people. They are cherished emotionally by people. It's part of the common heritage of humanity. But people are involved. And yesterday I had the honor of meeting 2 nurses at that location. Victoria, I think, was in a wheelchair, still suffering the effects of the 8th of October. She's a nurse, dedicated her life to help the children in intensive care. Another nurse, Anastasia, they were helping the ward that we saw destroyed, where children were having kidney dialysis. And miraculously, more children were not killed. I think they were the children that needed that treatment. The place had been evacuated. A grandfather lost his life, and we saw pictures and we saw evidence about the brutality of that strike. But there's power and heroism in so many Ukrainians, in so many survivors around the world. The nurses spoke, I think, very sincerely about knowing a doctor for 7 years, Svetlana. Her surname is Lukashenko. And she studied. She became, I think, an oncologist. She didn't have a family. She'd been an orphan, brought up an orphan. So one can imagine the hurdles that she faced, and she struggled. She educated herself. She didn't leave Ukraine when the bombs started landing. She was serving our rarest and most precious of all civilizations, which is our next generation. And she's gone. She was killed on that fateful day. So this shows the brutality of conflict, but also the demand, the imperative to keep stamina, to keep focus, to remain determined, that justice must be the birthright of every child. And that's what the president said. It is justice here in Ukraine as Ukraine fights for its life. There's great heroism. But if we don't stand up for something, we stand for nothing. If we don't stand up for justice here in Ukraine, what chance is there in Sudan or in Libya, with Myanmar, with the Rohingya, or in Palestine? We become frauds. We become collectively responsible for spouting promises of never again. The promise we made in the shadow of the gas chambers, the decimation of the Second World War, that future generations would not feel the scourge of war and would be protected by this architecture. So this has to be a start. The determination that is evidenced by you all being here, the determination of the President of Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, to fight for something beyond our life. We're all going to meet our makers one day. An opportunity to serve justice that is bigger than ourselves is critically important. Yesterday, we attended a meeting with the Joint Investigative Team. So there's many partners. There's 6 countries members of that Joint Investigative Team. The United States under Merrick Garland has an agreement to work with that. Ladislav as Eurojust. It's about partnerships. Everybody owns this space. Nobody can be a spectator. And the decision of Ukraine, the historic decision to ratify, to be the 125th state, to ratify the Rome Statute, I think is of historical significance. I hope that by the Assembly of State Parties in December, the instrument of ratification and Ukraine can take its seat. Because, as I've said, if we can be united for justice in Ukraine, we can have a real chance of not spouting platitudes and giving false promises that dissolve in the sunlight upstairs, but are felt by people who have no shelter. The architecture in this 75th year of the Geneva Conventions, last year was the 25th year of the Rome Statute. This architecture was not built for power, it was built for people. If we stay united for justice, we will be inevitably united for equity, we'll be united for humanity, and we will, God willing, be united for peace. Thank you for all the work you do, the work we do together, and we need to do more, because as we are speaking, people in Ukraine and people around the world are looking at us and hearing the promises of never again, and they want to see the power of the law and the protection of the law that is their God-given right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prosecutor Han. Our next speaker joining us online is the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders.
Thank you, dear Andrei, dear Karim, dear Ladislav, dear Ambassador Maternova, and dear Special Representative Patton. Good morning, everyone. The brutal reality of the Russian war of aggression is before our eyes, and before the eyes of the entire world. Death, casualties, the devastation and destructions that will be discussed at today's conference. Everything in Ukraine is a target for the aggressor. Energy and transport infrastructure, agricultural storage facilities, hospitals, supermarkets, sports centers, places where residents go every day. According to the most recent figures, over 3,000 educational facilities, including nurseries, have been destroyed. 840 medical institutions, 633 cultural facilities, 7,727 network and communication objects. The list goes on. What is under attack are the foundations of civilian life. Since the very beginning of this war, the European Union has been by the side of Ukraine's citizens and is determined to provide them the necessary support. Take the energy sector as an example. In the short term, we will keep providing emergency equipment, including generators and transformers. When the war is over, we will rebuild Ukraine's damaged energy sector, including with the windfall revenue from Russian sovereign assets and the 50 billion euro Ukraine facility. And we will encourage others to join these efforts, as we did during the Ukraine Recovery Conference early earlier this year. And in the long term, those responsible for the savage attacks on civilian targets will pay for the damage they have caused. Which brings us to the topic of today's conference. Accountability is a very complex process, more so given that it's taking place in the midst of war. Legal cases must be built on a watertight documentation of crimes. Investigative and prosecutorial approaches must be adapted to the full dimension of these crimes, so that effective justice is delivered to the victims of this war. These three aspects are at the center of our work on accountability with our Ukrainian colleagues and international partners. Firstly, on the evidentiary challenges. As you know, through Eurojust, the EU's Agency for Criminal Justice Cooperation, we have set up a tailor-made database to preserve, store, and analyze evidence of core international crimes. To date, this database contains more than 2,000 files. We can see already that the system helps connecting the dots. It connects information and evidence from different jurisdictions. It allows to identify evidence linked to the same events or involving the same people. It can thereby identify structural patterns in warfare which could mount to war crime. Second, investigations. It is clear that when dealing with evidence of crime on this scale, pooling resources from information to analysts and investigators or technical equipment can make a real difference. The work of the Joint Investigation Team on Ukraine at Eurojust shows that. It has been a driving factor in enhancing national investigations on international crimes committed in and against Ukraine. The close cooperation and collaboration between Ukraine, 6 member states of the European Union, the International Criminal Court, Eurojust, and Europol has also accelerated investigations by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. In particular, it has contributed to the arrest warrants issued by the ICC, including against President Putin. In addition, the setting up of a new international center at Eurojust, specifically for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine, has brought together relevant expertise in one place. While not sufficient to prove the crime of aggression by itself, evidence of the destruction of civilian objects can also contribute to establishing the crime of aggression. On the work of Eurojust, which I'm immensely proud of, I'm happy to see that Ladislav is present today. He will be able to speak in more detail about it. I know Karim has said this before, out of the darkness and suffering we have witnessed in Ukraine, the international community has consistently found new ways of working day after day. This work is more than an immediate response. It is emblematic of a more general commitment to the rule of law and strong justice systems. This is also why, dear Andrei, I want to welcome the important steps recently taken by Ukraine to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Third, delivering reserves for victims of this war. One angle here is where cases are tried. Another angle concerns compensation. On where cases are tried, of course, the ICC is a central actor, and it will always have the support of the European Union. The Commission has reiterated this several times. But I would like to be clear on this once more. All ICC state parties must fulfill their obligations to cooperate with the court and unconditionally execute its arrest warrants. Of course, there will also be national investigations and trials, where there are clear links to nationals of specific countries. Ukraine itself has, for example, already tried cases of environmental crimes committed in the context of the war of aggression. And then there is a possibility of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. Some of the cases we discussed today regarding attacks on civilian objects will no doubt fall into this category. The European Union is an active participant in the so-called core group, and I'm happy to report the significant progress that has been achieved recently on several important issues. This is encouraging in view of the next core group meeting on 17 September in Vienna that will need to bring the discussions forward on some remaining sensitive issues. We are, of course, aware of the importance of the choices that need to be done, but history is knocking on our door and we must act. The same applies to compensation. Russia must pay for the damage it has caused. The register of damage is now in place, and I'm very glad that since July, the European Union is a full participant of it. For the first category of claims, damage to residential property, the register has already received more than 8,500 claims. More categories relevant to today's discussions are being added to the system, including damage to civilian infrastructure. We are now working towards the next step, the establishment of a claims commission to start the adjudicatory process of claims. A first meeting took place in July in The Hague with the aim of having a final text to establish this international mechanism by the middle of next year. The European Commission is actively contributing to these discussions. To briefly conclude, dear friends, Russia's continued aggression only deepens our resolve and determination to seek justice. We all know this is not an easy task. Like the piecing together of any criminal case, it must be done in a systematic way, step by step. In this collective effort that brings us together today, dear Andrei, you can count on my personal commitment and on the resolve of the European Union. You need to continue to be united for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Renders. Our next speaker, also joining us online, is the Minister of Justice of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, David M. Van Wil.
Thank you, and dear Andre, dear guest, it's an honor to speak to you today, and I really regret that I can't be with you in person. I am, however, happy that the Netherlands is represented by our special envoy, Ms. Erika Schouten, there with you today. Russia's aggression towards our ally and friend Ukraine, the violence, the victims, the vile intentions, it never ceases to horrify us. Recently, the world witnessed more violent Russian attacks on Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, Russia launched a massive air attack on Ukraine's infrastructure and later also on Poltava and Lviv. Its power grid was hit, once again, killing civilians and causing serious damage and power outages across the country. When I saw the news, I experienced a mix of emotions that I felt many times before in regards to this war. Outrage at Russia's ruthlessness and sympathy for the people of Ukraine. In late 2021, when I was an Assistant Secretary General at NATO, I visited Odessa, and we visited a tabletop exercise on Russian attacks on Ukraine's power grid. So I was all the more horrified that over the recent years, the scenarios that we simulated came to real life. Even the destruction of the Kakova Dam. The human suffering and damage that destruction caused to agriculture, to the wider economy, and to the environment is simply beyond words. Every attack on critical infrastructure is a deliberate and malicious attempt to disrupt people's daily routines and to wear them down, to destroy their livelihoods and even their lives themselves. Every community depends heavily on energy and clean water. Critical infrastructure keeps us going. It's precious. As we've seen, it's also vulnerable. So it's vital that our countries work together to protect it. And it's reassuring and inspiring to see the Ukrainians working around the clock to repair the damage inflicted by Russia. And it's also commendable that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against high-ranking Russian officials suspected of directing attacks at civilian objects, including energy infrastructure. These crimes cannot go unpunished. The Netherlands, as a lead nation in restoring justice for Ukraine, will continue to assist Ukraine in protecting its critical infrastructure. And we will continue our support as part of the EU, NATO, and other international coalitions. The Netherlands is committed to sharing knowledge, experience, and best practices with the brave men and women of Ukraine. Russia's recent attacks only strengthen my country's resolve to support Ukraine, with whatever it takes, for as long as it takes. I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Wil. Please welcome our next esteemed speaker, the Minister of Justice of the Republic of Croatia, Damir Habjan.
Prosecutor General, Mr. Kostin, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by expressing condolence for all the suffering and pain that Ukrainian people are experiencing because of the unlawful Russian aggression. Croatia reiterates its firm support to the Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We remain committed to provide necessary assistance to the government and people of Ukraine for as long as it takes. We stand by your side, and that is why we are here today. When I see the images of such destruction of towns and civilian facilities, I cannot help but to think about Croatian towns of Vukovar, Dubrovnik, and many others that were 30 years ago also subject of such barbaric attack with only one aim: to hurt civilian population and to make their lives so unbearable so they must leave their homes. Like Ukraine, Croatia was also victim of aggression and found itself in apparent battle David against Goliath. During our homeland war, serious international crimes were committed on Croatian territory. Most tragically, with majority of civilian casualties and destruction of civilian objects. We still see the consequences of these crimes today, although we have rebuilt destroying towns and villages. Victims, individual and collective, remain behind those crimes. And the multi-year process of investigating and prosecuting such crimes. It should be emphasized that there is no judicial system in the world that will be able to perfectly cope with the challenges of conducting thousands of criminal proceedings for serious violations of international humanitarian law. There are more reasons for that. Mainly, these are very complex cases in terms of investigation and prosecution, and it's even more demanding when it takes place in parallel with war conflict, which is the case now here in Ukraine. Our experience showed that planning in advance is extremely important, especially if there is data on a large number of criminal offenses. Needless to say, education is crucial. That is where international help is more than indeed. To the end, we pledge our unwavering support to the investigations conducted by Ukrainian authorities and the ICC prosecutor. We welcome the process of Ukraine's certification of the Rome Statute. Additional efforts must be invested to overcome the accountability gap with regard to prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine, over which its existing circumstances the ICC cannot exercise jurisdiction. Dear colleagues, Croatia will continue to support Ukrainian courageous resistance as well as its efforts aimed at ensuring full accountability for the Russian brutal aggression, and remains a steadfast contributor to the international joint efforts in restoring justice for Ukraine. And we will continue to work together with our Ukrainian partners in sharing knowledge and experience of Croatian experts to Ukrainian investigators, prosecutors, and all other relevant authorities. The much desired peace can only be lasting if it's just. For peace to be just, it has to be anchored in accountability. For this reason, accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine must be upheld, not only because it provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Mr. Habyan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished guest from the United Kingdom, the Attorney General for England and Wales, Richard Hermer, KC.
Доброго ранку.
Good morning.
Some of you may know that on the 5th of July of this year, my country had a change of government. As happens in democracies, many things change when you change a government. But I want to tell you one thing that did not change, and that is the support of the government of the United Kingdom and the people of the United Kingdom for the people of Ukraine. And that is why I am here, and that is why it is such an honor to be here on behalf of the United Kingdom, to send a very clear message about the steadfast, unequivocal support of the United Kingdom for Ukraine in the face of Russia's illegal invasion, an unprovoked, premeditated, barbaric assault on a sovereign democratic state and a clear violation of the UN Charter. That is why it's an honor to be here. That is why it was the great honor for me and my colleagues at our very first cabinet meeting for the historic moment when President Zelensky attended and spoke to us. It was an extraordinary moment. It affirmed to us the importance of the Ukrainian struggle. And it is something on a personal level I and all of my colleagues will never forget. Now, just as we support Ukraine's right to fight for freedom, so we wholeheartedly support its fight for accountability. Accountability both for the atrocities that we have seen being committed, but also for the illegality from which it has flowed. And that is a fight that will take place on many fronts. And I'm delighted to stand here before the Prosecutor General, and I'm delighted to stand here before Prosecutor Khan. The United Kingdom is committed to supporting the ICC's independent investigation of the situation in Ukraine, and I warmly welcome the progress that we have seen so far. And through the Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group, working with our friends in the United States and in the EU, we are also providing advice and support to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to work together to enhance capacity to investigate and prosecute war crimes through the domestic system. And also, and this is important, the United Kingdom is working towards the establishment of the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression, working closely with our partners to get the details right so that any tribunal is both legally sound and attracts the broad international support that will be critical to its legitimacy and its efficacy. And I want to pause for one moment, if I may, because as a lawyer, and many of us here, friends, will be lawyers, we spend an inordinate amount of time, rightly, on the details and the complexity of the legal framework. And we're, of course, right to do so, and we must do so. But Prosecutor Khan, in his remarks today, reminded us that underlying the frameworks that we have sought to put in place since the close of the Second World War, underlying that is our shared belief in the dignity of humankind. And the stories that Karim was relaying of his day yesterday serve to underline all of us committed to international rules-based order, committed to international humanitarian law, committed to accountability for the worst crimes in law, that the reason we do it is because our belief in human dignity. And when we see victims crying, we all cry. And I was reminded, listening to Prosecutor Khan and sitting in the presence of the Prosecutor General, of the words of Martin Luther King, who said that we shall overcome because although the arc of humanity is long, it bends towards justice. So my government is completely committed to the rule of law. It is completely committed to justice and accountability for Ukraine, in The Hague, in the courts of Ukraine, to ensure that those responsible for the atrocities committed in Ukraine are held to account. And let me be very clear. From the battlefield to the courtroom, we are with Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Attorney General Hermer. Ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome our esteemed guest from the United Nations, the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten.
Dear Andriy Kostin, Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Karim Khan, ICC Prosecutor, distinguished ministers, prosecutors, attorney generals, President of Eurojust, UN colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to address this assembly on an issue of profound global significance: accountability for the entirety of the heinous crimes committed by Russian Federation in Ukraine. At the outset, let it be stated unequivocally, the crimes perpetrated since the start of the full-scale invasion represent some of the most egregious breaches of international humanitarian law. The first reports of sexual violence surfaced only a couple of days after the start of the full-scale invasion, and I recall issuing a first statement on the 28th of February. Today, we confront a grim tableau of widespread sexual violence against men, women, and children, with victims ranging from the age of 4 to 82 years. And these horrors inflict indelible trauma and transcends generations, and is a deliberate act of terror meant to dehumanize individuals and fracture the very fabric of society. Concurrently, the calculated destruction of essential infrastructure, such as electricity, energy sources, and water supply systems, are not merely collateral damages of warfare. They are deliberate strategies aimed at disempowering entire communities. And as we have seen, these attacks plunge millions into darkness and deprivation, interrupting basic services and propelling masses into an abyss of suffering. We also know how healthcare and educational institutions have been targeted with alarming frequency. Hospitals and medical facilities, sanctuaries of healing, have been reduced to rubble, rendering medical care inaccessible to countless individuals, including survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Educational facilities, symbols of hope and progress, have likewise been destroyed, jeopardizing the futures of entire generations. And none of these are isolated incidents. Like sexual violence, they are strategies aimed at inflicting maximum destruction and despair, destabilizing civilian life further, compounding their suffering, and hampering any prospect for recovery and resilience. And such violations of international human rights and humanitarian law are abhorrent, and their consequences resonate far beyond immediate victims, undermining entire communities. We gather here today as a global community, united by shared commitment to uphold justice, ensure accountability, and protect the sanctity of human rights. While the brutal war being waged against Ukraine is causing immense suffering, it has also, as many of you have highlighted, given rise to unprecedented, coordinated international action to ensure that those responsible for such atrocities are held accountable, whether through domestic judicial processes or international mechanisms and institutions. Understanding this intricate web of violations underscores the urgent need for a robust and comprehensive strategy to pursue justice and accountability. In the face of these atrocities, the demand for accountability is clear and imperative. The principles that underpin international law and human decency are not negotiable and must be upheld with unwavering commitment. We must reinvigorate our high-level attention to these crimes, ensuring they do not go unpunished, because it is through justice that we can provide redress to the victims, restore their dignity, and rebuild trust in legal and institutional frameworks that is often shattered by such widespread atrocities. Without it, we risk condoning a climate of impunity that predates the current conflict and threatens to permeate future landscape of warfare. A robust legal policy is essential to address the entirety of these crimes. Justice in Ukraine requires the use of all the tools in the accountability ecosystem. First, its domestic legislative framework must be fortified to ensure that it serves as a shield for the vulnerable and a sword against the violators. Existing instruments, such as the Geneva Conventions, the Rome Statute of the ICC, and the UN Security Council resolutions, must be rigorously implemented. As the territorial state, of course, Ukraine takes the lion's share of the accountability work, with the responsibility falling first and foremost on the Office of the Prosecutor General, which had to become overnight a war crimes prosecuting machine. And that is why, since the signing of a framework of cooperation on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence in May 2022, my office, through the team of experts on the rule of law, has been working very closely with the Office of the Prosecutor General, providing comprehensive technical and operational support to its specialized CRSV unit. And I am here today to really pledge continued support of my office towards the full implementation of that framework of cooperation so that we turn the tide on impunity for this crime. And let me conclude by saying that we have before us a moment of moral and legal reckoning. Our response to the crimes committed in Ukraine will intertwine with the broader narrative of global justice. And let this narrative be one of steadfast resolution and unwavering commitment to accountability. The task is daunting, but it is not insurmountable. And together, through the power of collective action and resolute purpose, we can ensure that the wheels of justice turn, that the voices of the victims are heard, and that the world heeds the call for accountability in its truest sense, We have a moral obligation to demonstrate to the people of Ukraine, including survivors of sexual violence, that international law is not an empty promise, and to perpetrators that the consequences of their crimes are not an empty threat. Together, let us pledge to build a future that honors the principle of justice and human rights, ensuring that the shadows of such violations never darken our world again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Patton. Dear participants, please welcome our colleague in the pursuit of justice, the President of Eurojust, Ladislav Hamran.
Thank you so much. Good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues. Before I will address you, the general audience, allow me please to address my colleagues and my partners at the Ukrainian Prosecution Service. Dear Mr. Kostin, dear fellow colleagues, over the past 2.5 years, we have been moved and inspired by the resilience of the Ukrainian Prosecution Service. Dear Andrei, your determination and strength are nothing short of incredible. Under normal conditions, the work of a prosecutor is demanding and challenging. But in times of war, when every day brings unimaginable hardship, the ability to continue working, let alone organize a conference of this scale, is something extraordinary. I would like to therefore to extend to my partners, dear colleagues and friends at the Ukrainian Prosecution Service, my heartfelt congratulations. And I truly believe that you have achieved, collectively achieved, in the last 2.5 years more than in the last 100 years. Congratulations. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to repeat the purpose of the conference and why we are here, but allow me please to highlight a few messages as an international prosecutor working at the international level for more than 17 years. Even in times of war, there are rules. International humanitarian law is very clear. Parties to conflict must distinguish between civilian objects and military targets. Civilian objects, those that do not serve a military purpose, simply cannot be targeted. This law exists to protect those who are not involved in armed conflicts, they are not fighting, and to safeguard the things which they need to survive. Violations of those principles can constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we, as international community, will not allow impunity for such acts. We all know that the acts on civilian objects are just one aspect of a much broader context, which is a much more complex crime base that defines this war. At Eurojust, we remain fully committed for making sure that the justice is done. We also know that the challenges ahead of us are immense. International criminal investigations are simply complex and demanding. They require patience, dedication, but also strong cross-border cooperation. As members of the international legal community, we have to keep pushing forward, especially when the road gets tough. And we owe this to our Ukrainian friends, to our Ukrainian people who have shown the world the true meaning of the word courage. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you, President Hamran. Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting the first discussion panel of our conference. We need to do a few technical things. The point of this conference will be destruction of energy infrastructure, the scale of damage and accountability. Please welcome our panelist and moderator, Deputy Head of the Council of Europe Office in Ukraine, Erland Falk, who will join us obviously in a few moments. Починаємо першу панель нашої конференції «Руйнування енергетичної інфраструктури, масштаби збитків та відповідальність». Запрошуємо учасників конференції. Модератором цієї дискусії буде заступник голови Офісу Ради Європи в Україні Ерленд Фалк. Ladies and gentlemen, I also want to kindly repeat my security announcement. For your safety, publishing the materials about this conference is prohibited until 3 p.m. Шановні пані та панове, учасники конференції, нагадую вам, що з безпекових міркувань публікація будь-яких матеріалів щодо цієї конференції заборонена до 15:00. Ladies and gentlemen, also briefly about the format of our work today, we will have 5 discussion panels, which are scheduled to conclude by 5:30 p.m. Also, we will have lunch and dinner. And there will be closing remarks after our discussion panels will end. These closing remarks will be delivered by our esteemed guest. So we are almost ready to start our first discussion panel, and I want to remind you that the point of this panel is destruction of energy infrastructure, the scale of damage and accountability. Ladies and gentlemen, also I want to inform you, if you need a simultaneous translation, you can get an equipment for it near the entrance to this venue. So dear panelists, please enter to the scene. So all participants of the first discussion panel is here, and we are ready to start. Mr. Falk, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that, dear all participants, dear all guests, dear panelists. First of all, a very good morning to all of you. It's really a privilege for me to moderate this first plenary discussion on what is not only an extremely important topic, but also a very timely discussion on the destruction of civilian and in this case, energy infrastructure. We started this morning with a very impactful video. We've all seen the consequences the war of aggression has had on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. We've seen the disruption of vital services, and we've seen the humanitarian consequences. The goal of this panel is to shed some light on the scale and the impact of the destruction, on what is being done to document it, and importantly, what is done to ensure accountability, both here in Ukraine, but also internationally through international mechanisms and international cooperation. We have a really excellent panel today that I think has been very well put together, and that should be able to discuss and assess this topic from a few different angles, a few different perspectives. With with this panel, I will not spend a lot of time introducing the details of the subject, but I wanted to say from a Council of Europe perspective that we are really happy that these discussions on accountability are taking place and that there are important processes moving forward. From our perspective, this war of aggression against Ukraine is the biggest threat, the biggest challenge, the biggest assault against the values our organization was founded on in the aftermath of the Second World War. And so we've made accountability a top priority in all of our work through the Reykjavik Declaration, through excluding Russia as a member state of the Council of Europe in the early days of the war. And we're very happy to be part of discussions like this and also to be an important part of some of the international mechanisms, frameworks that are put in place to ensure accountability, like what was mentioned, the International Register of Damage, like the Riga Principles on compensation, and like the ongoing discussions on the establishment of a special tribunal. And so with that as a background, I'm very excited now to turn to our panel. We have 6 excellent panelists. We have about 50 minutes, so we are a bit richer on expertise than we are on time. So I would ask all panelists to keep to your agreed upon time. I have a small timekeeper with me here that will make a small sound when you have about 30 seconds left. So I hope no one takes offense for that. It makes sounds completely without discrimination. So with that, I would like to turn to our first speaker of today. And as our first speaker, we are very lucky to have the Minister of Energy for Ukraine, Mr. Herman Galochenko. Mr. Galochenko, you, of course, served as Minister of Energy since 2021. But I know you've also had a long career in different government institutions. You've served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you've served in the President's Office, and you've also had a long experience with energy markets, with legal disputes, with international relations, with international courts. So I think with that background, no one is better placed to talk about this topic than you. So Mr. Galochenko, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, welcome to everyone. I would like to start with the presentation just to show the consequences of the attacks to the energy infrastructure. That is, you could see the numbers. So in fact, that is the attacks which was started, the massive attacks in 2022, and they are continuing now. So I mean, every night they are using drones to attack our energy infrastructure. You could see that is, I would say that is the preliminary numbers of destructions and the numbers of attacks. That is the map of Ukraine, and you could see there is no place, no regions, no energy infrastructure which was not hit during these attacks. And of course, that is the generation facilities, substation, gas facilities, and all kinds of production of electricity. So in fact, that is against electricity and heating. And what we see that this year attacks, one of the main targets, our gas infrastructure. That is a total loss in our capacity for the attacks of this year. That is only this year. The attack started March 22. And you could see that we lost more than something around 9 gigawatt in our system. I just want to give you a figure that the peak consumption the previous winter was around 18. So that's almost a half of a generation which was lost. And the number of hydro station, thermal power plants, CHPs, solar, which were attacks. And of course, we have something around 18 gigs in occupation. Of course, they're not, in fact, trying to hide the goals of this attack. So you could see in Russian media they're talking that they want Ukrainians to suffer. And I mean, of course, that is really a challenge for the people. And when we are talking about the restriction of supply, economic impact, healthcare, migration, of course, it have the impact to the migration, more pressure to the people, and the willing to exhaust Ukrainians. I should remind, of course, the Kakhovka Dam explosion. That is very important, and that is not only about the energy, because that is more about the ecocide also story, but what is also very important, that explosion dramatically have the dramatic impact on the safety and security on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And that is also very important to remember. That's the result of destruction of Kakhovka, and again, I would say that is not the biggest generation facility, but that is more the ecocide problem. Let's come to the biggest attack. So it was a little recently, I might say 2 weeks ago, on Monday. That is what the biggest attack to Ukrainian infrastructure from the beginning of full-scale invasion. So 236 drones and missiles at once, different type of missiles. This time they are using ballistic missiles to attack our substation. And that is something new for us also. So, and the immediate effect of this attack was that something around 4 million Ukrainians were immediately disconnected in emergency manner. And of course, it's have the direct impact on 12 regions of Ukraine, and it take us something around 13 days to restore complete supply of electricity. It was very, just to compare the figures, 236, the previous biggest attack was on March 22, 150. So you should also understand how they increase the numbers of these attacks to the energy infrastructure. What is also very important, and that is the point which we discussed very deeply with the EIA. The last week, Grossi was here. We had a number of meetings, so we address our message to them. In Ukraine energy system, nuclear is a basic generation, and now it's produced something around 60% of all electricity of the country. These attacks to the substation have dramatic impact on the nuclear safety and security, because a number of nuclear units were in emergency shutdown regime, which is far from any pillars of nuclear safety and security. But what is also important, that it means that Russians attacking the energy infrastructure at the same time, even without direct attack to the nuclear, without direct attack, they attacking nuclear standards of safety and security. That, as you could see, the figures of disconnection around the regions, the situation is was very difficult after this attack. Of course, we have all international instruments, and we have all provisions concerning how to qualify in the legal manner, how to qualify these attacks. But I can tell you that, of course, they are seeking for total blackout of the country. And that is far from any rules of war, that is far from any frames of legislation which exist on international law and any principles. You know, UN Charter or whatever, we could discuss this. But the problem which I see, I mean, and we see, of course, that is very important that we have to put it as the evidence of this general terror of Russia against Ukraine. But, you know, we have just a number of already resolutions. We have a number of decisions of international forum, different forum, which are which exclude double wording, so they are very precise, like immediately withdraw Russian troops from Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, for example. The problem which we see, that they don't care. And that is really the challenge for all civilized world. That is the challenge for international order. How to push them just to follow these resolutions. I could call at least 5 resolutions on that issue, even more. UN, Security Council, Board of Governors of EIA, General Conference on EIA, but they don't care. They don't care. And that is, I think, the one, at least as an energy minister, you mentioned my background, so my first job was the prosecutor office. And I understand that in the energy field, we have one really instrument which could work, and this instrument is sanctions. I'm really convinced if we will manage to provide sanctions to the energy sector of Russia, they already exist, but we need to strengthen them. We need to exclude possibility to find the ways to escape from these sanctions, and we need to add sanction on nuclear. I think that could somehow push them, at least to stop these criminal actions which they're doing again and planning again the Ukrainian energy system. And what is also very important, because we are monitoring each attack, and we are living in these attacks from 2022. We see that the roadmap for these attacks, prepared by the energy staff, that is not a Russian military who is planning how to attack, because they really have a group, probably, I don't know, some energy people who make this roadmap and just give this roadmap to Russians. Then they see how they check how we reconnect, what we repair, what we substitute, and then they give another map and another map. It's very important that we should find all these criminals who are energy people. Probably they do not think that they are criminals because they just advise. But it's very important to find all of them and put them to jail. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Golochenko. It's really devastating to hear about the scale and consequences of the destruction, but also somewhat comforting to hear about what is being done to ensure accountability. We will continue the focus on accountability, and I'm happy to invite as our next speaker, Mr. Alexei Komenko. Mr. Komenko, you are the first Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine. You've served in the prosecution service for more than 20 years, and since 2023 you also led investigations into war crimes and attacks on critical infrastructure.
Thank you, dear Mr. Moderator. Good day, dear participants of the very important conference today. It's a pleasure to be able to address you in this panel dedicated to the destructive nature of the crimes of the Russian Federation against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. As it was mentioned previously, for now, the prosecutor's office provides for work in more than 137,000 cases committed by the Russians. The IHL doesn't know a crime that wouldn't be committed in the territory of our country, from mass shootings of the prisoners of war, civilians, to the total destruction of civilian infrastructure. However, there is a type of crime that has to do with everyone, even those who live in the territory of Ukraine, irrespective of their nationality. It's the deliberate destruction of our energy infrastructure. From the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Russian Federation has launched over 1,000 attacks against more than 2,000 objects, more than 200 energy facilities. You see that they happened in all regions of Ukraine. All the while, some of the energy facilities were stricken by more than 40%. Because of the sensitive nature of this information, we cannot speak of what that is, but I want to tell you that more than 40 attacks were launched on the same energy facility. Regarding the methods of warfare that Russia uses against our infrastructure, you see on these slides all the range of types of warfare that Russians use against our energy infrastructure, from artillery shells to hypersonic missiles, from the drones that have a few kilograms of the explosive nature to X1 that has a ton of such explosive unit. All the while, all the types of energy generating enterprises are the target of these attacks, the ones generating the energy, also hydroelectric power plants. Even there are strikes against the solar energy generation in Ukraine. For now, in these types of armaments and arms you can see on the slides, for the Ukrainian energy system, we see the damages of over $1 billion. However, nobody can say for sure, because it's very difficult to calculate, and the repercussions are still ongoing. However, if the energy infrastructure is at least somehow possible, to renew, I'd like to say that these strikes took life of civilians, also workers of these energy facilities and energy generating facilities. 35 civilians died because of these attacks. Over 100 persons have been injured. I'd also like to draw your attention to the period of the strikes against energy facilities launched by Russian Federation. As you all know, the first systemic attacks started in October 2022, with the beginning of the cold weather to cause maximum damage to civilians. Up to the March of 2023, more than 300 attacks were launched. However, thanks to the heroic efforts of the energy sector employers and employees of the emergency services, we avoided catastrophic consequences. The second period, as you can see, the Russian Federation accumulated its resources to have the most damage to our energy sector. From March 2023, there were over 400 attacks, as you can see on the next slide. There are some differences, and the attacks have become more severe. More combined attacks are used. The strikes of higher intensity are used. We see that to strike against energy facilities, aviation bombs are now used. Even hypersonic missiles, as you all know, the purpose is to destroy especially important military objects such as command facilities or some even ships for airplanes to take off. But as we see, the enemy thinks that our energy infrastructure is that important object for them to use that missiles. If in previous years there were no attacks against gas infrastructure, this year we see severe damage both for the extraction of gas and for the gas storage units, which also is done because the winter is coming, and the enemy thinks that our people will not survive this winter. As to the legal qualification of the actions committed by the Russian Federation, we classify it as a war crime because there is no military advantage from striking our critical energy infrastructure. Everybody understands that the fact that people who are very far away from the front line and they cannot take children to school or collect them from school or to have their basic physiological needs, it has no impact on the military advantage, on the military theater. We understand that we classify it as one of the elements of genocide, as one of the elements of creating in the territory of Ukraine, making the territory of Ukraine impossible to a situation impossible to live in, some unlivable situation. We have identified a number of Russian military service people from the command. We have 7 suspicions. All of them are top officials and top officers who gave orders to strike civilian infrastructure and who made sure that those attacks were launched. As you see, it is Kabalash, the aviation commander, and Chernomorsk Fleet Sokolov commander. Also, we have identified up to the level of the divisions and platoons. However, we are still working on that in that regard. For now, around the clock, our investigators, prosecutors, our operative staff are working on that. Despite all the circumstances, they go right after the attacks were launched, even though this very horrible tactics that the enemy is using when they strike, when the energy sector comes there, when the emergency services go there. Unfortunately, we have losses among investigators who were doing these procedural actions, in particular in energy facilities. I'd like to especially thank our military experts and the interagency working group that I have the honor to co-chair, and the military experts headed by General Lieutenant Krishtun, who provide very high-class, high-level support. We use their expertise and their knowledge in all types of arms. Therefore, rest assured, dear participants of this conference, dear international partners, that the work is ongoing, and we will see even more and more faces here. Thank you.
Mr. Komenko, before moving to the next speaker, I would like to announce that the Minister of Energy needs to leave due to an urgent meeting. But Mr. Golochenko, thank you so much for your contributions. Talking about accountability, a very important question is, of course, also what is happening at the international level. And to talk about that, we're very lucky to have with us Brenda Hollis, Principal Trial Lawyer at the International Criminal Court. Brenda, you've led prosecutions in the International Criminal Court, also the Special Court for Sierra Leone, including the trial against former Liberian President Charles Taylor. You've also worked extensively on cases involving crimes against humanity, war crimes, sexual violence, including in conflict zones. As principal trial lawyer at ICC, you also now lead the investigations into war crimes committed in Ukraine. So with this background, Brenda, could I ask you to tell us a bit about how you see the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure through the lens of the Rome Statutes?
Thank you very much. I'm glad that I'm here today to speak with you. I'd like to start off in a more general way. As human beings, as fellow members of the international community, I and the men and women of the Ukraine Unified Team at the ICC are, of course, affected by the loss of life, by the physical injury, by the emotional and mental suffering that the people of Ukraine experience every day and have experienced for years. And we are firmly committed to establishing criminality of conduct in Ukraine and also accountability for that conduct. In order to do that, we have to act objectively. We have to step back from the emotional reaction to what is happening and objectively collect and assess evidence to determine, number one, is there a crime that was committed? If so, what is that potential crime? And here we're talking, of course, about attacks on civilian objects and specifically the attacks on the electric infrastructure of Ukraine. So how do we determine if there is a crime, what would the crime be? We look primarily at the nature of the object itself. What purpose does it serve? Who are the primary beneficiaries of that service? And looking at that, what is the location of this object? Some objects are clearly civilian. Churches, hospitals, objects that are not being used for military purposes. Some are clearly military. Attacks on aircraft, military ships, munitions factories. But when we look at the electric power grid, that, if you might say, could be a dual purpose object, serving both the military and the civilian society. So how do we determine how we characterize it? Well, we look at who are the primary users of that service. How much does the military benefit from that service? How much does the military depend upon that service to carry out its military activities in the midst of conflict? These are the kind of factors we look at to determine, is it civilian or is it military? And why is that important to us? Because as prosecutors looking at potential crimes, the crimes are different if it's civilian or it's military. And because the crimes are different, the underlying components of those crimes, the elements of those crimes are different. And because of that, the kind of evidence we have to look for and gather is different. Now, there was a movie once where one of the actors was talking to his investigators, and he said, you know, there are things we think we know, there are things we know, and there are things we can prove. As a prosecutor, as a criminal investigator, we're only interested in the third category. What can I prove? What can I prove objectively? What can I prove in a way the judges will accept that proof to show crimes were committed and these people are responsible for those crimes? So if we determine that an object is a civilian object, what do we have to prove? Well, first of all, and again, I'm speaking of the legal framework at the International Criminal Court. First of all, we have to prove that that was the intended target, that they didn't aim for something else and hit that target, but that was what they wanted to hit. So it was an intentional attack. And then we have to prove that the nature of that object was it was civilian. Now, if it's a civilian object, we could stop there in terms of establishing the crime. However, we go on to establish the kind of harm that was occasioned by the impact, by the attack on that object. That is important to show the seriousness of that crime, which is important at the International Criminal Court because we look at gravity as one of the factors. Is it seriously sufficient to prove in a case before the ICC? But as and perhaps more importantly, we look at the seriousness of the harm because it's very important to sentencing should that person be convicted. The more serious the harm, the more severe punishment we can ask for. That's if it's a civilian object. If it's a military object, the person can still be accountable for it, but it's a different crime and we have a more complex and a different analysis that we have to undergo. So we do have to show again that that was the intended target. They hit what they were aiming at. Now, for both civilian and military targets, one of the ways we prove that is to look at the type of weapon that was used. How accurate is that weapon? how often was that target hit? Because if it's a very accurate weapon and they have repeatedly hit that target, the reasonable inference from that is that's what they were aiming at. That's what they intended to hit. But in addition to that, if it's a military target, we have to show that they hit that target with the knowledge that there would be incidental, that is collateral harm to civilians, either physical injury or death, to a civilian object, or that there would be widespread, severe, and long-lasting negative impact on the environment. So they have to hit that target with that knowledge. Now, for the electric infrastructure in Ukraine, how would we establish that knowledge? Well, they know about the infrastructure in Ukraine. They basically were building the infrastructure in Ukraine. They understand the impact of that attack. They understand who the primary users are. And they also understand, very significantly, that in Ukraine, as well as most militaries around the world, they do not rely on the national electric infrastructure for their power generation and their power distribution. They may use it during times of peace, but they know that during wartime, they have to have an independent source of energy and independent distribution. So they also know that, because again, this is a power structure that they were instrumental in building. They had regular reports about it up until just before all of this aggression began in Ukraine. So we use that to show the knowledge of what the impact on civilians and civilian objects and the environment would be for attacking the civilian power infrastructure. So that's the kind of thing that we look at to determine what crimes might be committed, and we also look at their knowledge and what kind of military impact hitting that target would have, what military advantage it would have. So those are some of the things that we look at as we move forward with these crimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Brenda. As the next speaker, I would like to give the word to Ms. Erika Schutte, the lead of a Netherlands-Ukraine task force. Erika, I know you are in a rush and need to leave soon, but could you tell us a bit about the role of the Netherlands in supporting Ukraine's justice efforts?
Thank you very much, and apologies in advance that I will have to rush off after a few brief remarks. I'm really honored to be here. I just started in my new role as Special Envoy for Ukraine from the Netherlands. I come from the city of The Hague, the city of peace and justice, and when the Ukrainian authorities asked us early on to take the lead on point 7 of the peace formula, we were very happy to oblige. We have a new government. As the colleague from the UK said, we're in the same situation in the sense that we have a new government, but our commitment to assisting Ukraine, and especially in the field of accountability, remains exactly the same. The first visit of our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense was to Ukraine, not to the neighboring countries, as is the habit, but to Ukraine, to Kiev and Odessa. And 2 weeks ago, our Prime Minister visited Zaporizhia, where he met with President Zelensky. And we're talking today about accountability for major Russian attacks on critical energy infrastructure, which is a very important issue. But apart from the accountability, it's also very important that we step up the practical support to Ukraine with winter approaching. And therefore, I'm happy that the Prime Minister, when he visited Zaporizhia, also brought a new package of support, mainly focused on the energy sector. Let me very briefly mention 3 points where we think that, well, let me say, Russia has a comprehensive strategy planning and executing its destruction of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, and we should also develop a comprehensive response. And when it comes to accountability, I think it's crucial for us as a member of the international community to support the Ukrainian judicial system as much as we can. We do it through providing equipment through the EU mission here in Ukraine. By deploying forensic teams, we gifted a forensic lab, also by fact-finding done by the HRMMU represented here, and we're very happy to support that. So many ways in which we need to support the Ukrainian judicial system, because the bulk of the workload in the end will be with them. I'm not going to dwell on the importance of the work that the ICC is doing, because it was so very eloquently expressed by Brenda. But we are very aware that the caseload of the ICC has increased with the work on Ukraine and other crises in the world, and therefore we have stepped up our support to the ICC, and we call upon others to do the same. We're happy that the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, located in The Hague, is now up and running. And we are continuing the work as a member of the core group to discuss the modalities of the aggression tribunal. And then last but definitely not least, we see it as upon us, but also upon other members of the international community, to keep raising this issue everywhere, to keep it at the top of the agenda. And we do that by bringing it up in all the bilateral meetings that we have, in multilateral fora, in meetings of the Security Council, for instance, in February. We organized a conference in The Hague in April, a ministerial conference that was very successful on restoring justice for Ukraine. We need to be very focal on this. We know that the number of attacks is staggering, but we can never get used to it. And for you, the people here in Ukraine, it's a daily reality, it's a horror. But for us in the international community, we need to be keenly aware of the impact that this has, and be all the more resolved to stand with you and to support you. We're in here for the long haul, but we're also committed to support you for the long haul. Thank you very much, and with that, my apologies, but I have to rush off. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Erica, and I know you need to leave now, so thank you for your contribution. As the next speaker, I would now like to introduce Ms. Danielle Bell, who is the head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Danielle, you worked over 2 decades, I believe, on human rights issues in conflict and post-conflict settings. You've had senior UN roles in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, where you work to document human rights abuses and promote accountability. You're now heading a team monitoring human rights violations in Ukraine. Can I ask you to tell us a bit about the documentation the UN Monitoring Mission has done here in Ukraine on attacks on energy infrastructure?
Great, thank you so much. And first, good morning, Excellencies, esteemed government representatives, dear colleagues. I'm honored to be joining this panel at such a crucial time, and I hope my comments today will complement the legal and technical perspectives already provided, and I'll speak a little bit about the work that my team has done in terms of documenting the effects on civilians as a consequence of the Russian Federation's coordinated attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So, since the first wave of attacks out in March of this year, our team has conducted visits to damaged thermal and hydroelectric power plants and energy substations. And we're extremely grateful to the private and state-owned companies that have facilitated access to their sites. And so visiting these sites has provided my team with a deep understanding of the deliberate and repeated damage that's been inflicted on Ukraine's energy network. We've also visited communities across the country that have suffered from heating, water, and power outages as a result of these attacks. And we've interviewed dozens of residents, teachers, technical experts, local officials, social service workers, to gain a first-hand perspective of the consequence of these attacks. The harm to the civilian population has been both foreseeable and wide-ranging, with reverberating effects on water distribution, heating, sewage and sanitation, public health, displacement, and the economy. And so I'll provide a few examples of how the daily lives of civilians have been affected in these areas, particularly vulnerable people. So let me begin with high-rise buildings and apartments, because this is where most people in the large cities live. So the power outages have made life in high-rise buildings difficult, especially for families with small children, older people, people with mobility issues, because the elevators stop working. And so people are essentially trapped in their homes. And without power, basic tasks like cooking and cleaning and taking care of children and older people and taking them outside, these become more challenging, which of course disproportionately affects women who often are the primary caregivers. Water and sanitation in many high-rise buildings has also been disrupted, as probably everyone in the room has experienced, because electric pumps are needed to distribute water to the upper floors. We've documented numerous effects on healthcare. So while healthcare facilities and clinics are required to have backup generators, these aren't sufficient for prolonged outages. At home, critical medical devices such as oxygen masks, insulin pumps, they can't function without power, which endangers those who have medical conditions. And without refrigeration, some medications degrade. Prolonged power outages also increase the possibility of untreated water spreading infectious diseases, which poses heightened risk to older persons, infants, and the immunocompromised. On education, almost 1 million Ukrainian children are studying online due to security concerns. And so these power outages basically prevent them from accessing the internet, which limits their educations. It isolates them from their peers and teachers, and it worsens the psychological impacts of the war. And we're also seeing that these continued power cuts are increasingly a factor in cross-border displacement, because a lack of heating, power, and access to education may push even more people to flee. So vulnerable populations, older persons, persons with mobility challenges, internally displaced, and low-income households are disproportionately affected by energy-related challenges, and sustained support will be essential for them. So power banks, eco-flows, generators, and these measures that some of us have been able to use to mitigate the effects of the power cuts are out of reach for so many. But the reality is even more severe. So for example, when we're interviewing social services workers that are managing the IDP sites and the shelters, we're hearing from them about struggles to even provide basic necessities like food, water, and medicine during the power outages. And we can expect that these challenges will intensify as winter approaches, because cold temperatures will increase energy needs. And the situation will be even more severe if further attacks occur, as we saw the consequences following the strikes on the 26th of March. The harm to civilians from these attacks was imminently foreseeable. Ukraine's urbanized infrastructure, which of course is dependent on centralized heating, water, and electricity, meant that these attacks inevitably would have devastating consequences. In the coming days, my team will be releasing a dedicated report on this topic. In conclusion, our goal is to contribute to discussions on addressing these challenges facing Ukraine's civilians. And we hope that our united collective efforts towards accountability for violations of international humanitarian law will bear fruit. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. Danielle, I know we are now eating into people's coffee breaks, but as our last speaker of today, I would like to invite Christian Levesque. Christian, you're the director of the War Crimes Accountability Department of the U.S. Department of Justice, and you're now leading efforts to support Ukraine's accountability initiatives. So, Christian, can I ask you to elaborate a bit on how you see the recent attacks, how the efforts of the U.S. Department of Justice to support Ukraine, and also maybe a bit on the role you see national authorities playing in this process?
Well, thank you very much. As we focus our discussions today on attacks that have had large-scale and devastating consequences, including on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, I want to reiterate that the United States is committed to working with Ukraine and our international partners to ensure accountability when crimes are committed as part of Russia's war of aggression. On the panel alone today, we've heard from experts who, together with their teams, are contributing to the collective efforts of accountability in different ways. And I'd like to just discuss the role that national authorities outside of Ukraine can play in these accountability efforts, with a particular focus on the U.S. Department of Justice. Like so many other national authorities, the United States does have limited jurisdiction over war crimes when they are committed outside of the United States. This includes for us when the victim or perpetrator is a U.S. national or a legal permanent resident or a U.S. service member. It also includes U.S. dual citizens. Unlike some jurisdictions, the United States does not have universal jurisdiction over war crimes. But we do have jurisdiction if the perpetrator later is present in the United States after the war crime has occurred, and also if the war crime occurred after a recent amendment to our law that occurred in January of 2023. We call this present in jurisdiction, and it was a big expansion of our law. As the Attorney General Garland said, this change in the law means that in the years and decades to come, Russian war criminals who set foot in our country should expect to find themselves in a U.S. court of law, and we're working to make that happen. The limitations in jurisdiction that I have just mentioned do not deter us and should not deter us or other national authorities who are facing similar challenges from pursuing accountability and from marshaling all of our legal tools to achieve this common goal. After U.S. Attorney General Garland created the War Crimes Accountability Team, or WARCAT as we call it, which is based in the Criminal Division in the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section at the Department of Justice, he announced back in December of last year charges for war crimes committed against a U.S. victim who had been residing in Ukraine when the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Those indictment charged 4 Russia-affiliated military commanders and soldiers with unlawfully confining, threatening, interrogating, repeatedly abusing, and torturing, which included carrying out a mock execution of a U.S. national. These allegations involve heinous acts, and no person, even in a time of war, should be forced to endure them. We made the decision at the time to unseal that indictment to fully reveal to our Ukrainian partners, as well as our international partners and the public more generally, that the United States, the Department of Justice, and our U.S. law enforcement partners are doing their part to hold perpetrators of atrocities accountable in the context of Russia's unjustified war against Ukraine. We have repeatedly emphasized that this investigation and this indictment would not have been made possible without the assistance of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. That kind of assistance was facilitated and enhanced by the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between AG Garland and Prosecutor General Kostin. That was back in September of 2022. It's been through this MOU that the Department of Justice and the Prosecutor General's Office have really demonstrated a commitment to cooperate and to share information concerning these investigations of war crimes and related criminal offenses. But further to this point of accountability efforts and cooperation, although the US authorities do not discuss the details of ongoing investigations, regardless of the context or the alleged violations of the law, the AG has made very clear that the Department of Justice and our law enforcement partners continue to pursue accountability, including with active investigations that are open today in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These investigations take time, and although as prosecutors and investigators, we do pursue them with urgency, we can't let the gravity of these alleged crimes or the scope of the destruction compromise our adherence to investigatory and prosecutorial best practices, or more generally, the rule of law. We know that our Ukrainian partners and our international partners share this commitment. This commitment, as well as the goal of building investigations and cases that can withstand judicial scrutiny, really underscores the importance of continuing to collaborate and assist, particularly in the areas of evidence sharing, consistent with the laws and policies of our respective countries and institutions. And in practice, we have experienced unprecedented levels of coordination and efforts to enhance the effectiveness of information and evidence sharing between countries and international bodies. Doing this requires that prosecutors and investigators fully understand their own laws and policies to really maximize the use of formal but also informal procedures for information and evidence sharing. And it's precisely this kind of understanding and cooperation between prosecutors and investigators that was critical for us in being able to file those war crimes charges that I just mentioned. It continues to be critical today in our ongoing criminal investigations. The Department of Justice does work in other ways with our Ukrainian partners to support their accountability efforts in all respects. This includes providing legal, technical, investigative assistance, including capacity building trainings, case-based mentoring to both our partners in the Prosecutor General's Office and then also to the National Police of Ukraine, not only through WARCAT, but also other Department of Justice's offices and our resident legal advisor program, which is based here in Kyiv. The U.S.'s strong support of the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, which includes the Attorney General's appointment of a special prosecutor for the crime of aggression, also reflects our continued commitment to accountability for Russian aggression. And this is in addition to our engagement with the core group of states for the establishment of a special tribunal. The U.S. Departments of Education's support for Ukraine isn't limited to just war crimes accountability, but also to other related forms of accountability. As just one example, the department targets through various initiatives and legal tools the financial enablers and facilitators and procurement networks fueling the Russian war machine. And it also counters efforts by hostile nation states that are trying to illicitly acquire U.S. sensitive technology.
Christian, can I ask you to,
yes.
to wrap up
to wrap
within
up?
30,
Sure.
30 seconds?
Sure.
Thank you.
But you're going to hear more about that later today. So what I'll just say is we're joined also by other partners, of course, within the U.S. Government, and we continue to reiterate our support of key institutions in Ukraine and elsewhere. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Christian, we are running quite a lot over time, so I don't want to stand between people in the last 10 minutes of your coffee break, but I just wanted to sincerely thank all panelists for your contributions, and also the Office of the Prosecutor General for arranging this important conference. So thank you very much, and please enjoy your coffee.
Thank you very much, esteemed participants. Ladies and gentlemen, after such a meaningful discussion, we would like to take a short break, but since we are a little bit behind our schedule, it will be shorter than we initially planned. So I'm kindly asking you to be in your seats by 5 minutes past 12, and we will continue our discussion panels. Also, I want to pay your attention. To your left, you can see an exhibition showcasing some long-range weaponry Russia used to terrorize Ukraine almost every day. But it's not all. There is also a VR zone where you can take a virtual tour on the sites of Russian war crimes. It's fascinating, it's terrifying, and it's crucial, so please don't miss this opportunity. Enjoy your meal. Thank you.